On this edition of the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast.
I mean, in a way, the Coyote cinema critics had already been doing this, hadn't they? I mean, they admired American filmmakers like Hitchcock and Otto Preminger and Wells and Wyler and Hawks, you know, so they were already talking about the Hollywood filmmakers as artists in a way that those directors really weren't spoken about at home. You know, they were considered purveyors of entertainment rather than purveyors of art.
That's Dr. Gary Bettinson, a lecturer in film studies from Lancaster University in the UK, and he's here with me to talk about an era of film history that is often overlooked, especially by somebody like me because this is the era of cinema I grew up in. It's called the New Hollywood Cinema, and it stretches from the late 60s and into the 70s. These were the days before the age of the blockbuster, and it's a very interesting period that made significant contributions to the history of cinema. And you might consider it to be the American response to the French New Wave. The key directors of this period include Sidney Lumet, Richard Donner, Arthur Penn, Martin Scorsese, Hal Ashby, Francis Ford Coppola, Roman Polanski, Steven Spielberg, and even George Lucas. Why is a podcast primarily concerned with Christian filmmaking talking about cinema history? Because Christian filmmakers need to know cinematic history. It's no surprise that some of the most successful filmmakers have the widest knowledge of cinema history. Scorsese, Spielberg, and Tarantino, and I could name many others, these guys are walking cinema historians. Every writer who teaches writing tells their students that the most important thing they can do besides writing is to read widely. The same is true for filmmakers. The most important thing you can do as a filmmaker, besides make movies, is to watch movies. And I don't just mean the new releases. We need to know what other filmmakers have done in other eras outside of our current age. So these folks from the Academy love the cinema as much as I do, and they've devoted themselves to the study of this art form in a way that I haven't. And to be honest, talking with these folks, for me, is a lot of fun. This is episode 24. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a lecturer in film studies at Lancaster University in England. I get to teach a range of different types of film, including New Hollywood, which we're talking about today. I guess, should we specify what we mean by that term?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, there's no real consensus on what it denotes as a term. Roughly speaking, critics, historians tend to accept that it describes a period of Hollywood filmmaking from 1967 to 1975, with some kind of overspill at both ends, you know. So I say that 1967, with the release of The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde, inaugurated a new kind of filmmaking that came to an end in 75 with Jaws, which ushered in the blockbuster mode of production that pretty much has dominated Hollywood mainstream cinema ever since.
Huh, interesting. So Jaws was the final straw.
According to a lot of historians, yeah. Some people say Star Wars a couple of years later. But certainly by the mid to late 70s, the blockbusters sort of supplanted the more low-budget countercultural strain of filmmaking that had briefly come to prominence in the early 70s and the tail end of the 60s. Well, I think Scorsese thinks there's quite a bit of difference, judging from his recent comments.
Oh, really? What did he say?
He's been talking about the comic book movies, the superhero franchise films that, you know, are released nowadays. I think he said something like they're not art, and that caused, you know, a kind of backlash on social media amongst the fans of those movies, as you'd expect. He wrote a more detailed, kind of nuanced explanation of his perspectives. I think he's broadly feels that the days of the auteur filmmakers have pretty much been squeezed out by studio big budget franchise blockbusters that are more about commerce than art. These are old debates really, but they resurface periodically.
When did he say that?
Fairly recently. He wrote an article, I think, for the New York Times where he elaborates on his position.
Tell me a little bit more about this new Hollywood cinema. What was happening before the new Hollywood cinema came in?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the classical studio system collapsed after the Paramount decrees in 1948. This kind of antitrust decree that stipulated that the major studios had to divorce their exhibition concerns and sort of sell up their movie theaters and become effectively producer distributors.
Huh.
So that led to a period of industrial reconfiguration through the 1950s and 60s and into the early 70s. So it was quite a sustained period of instability. And through the 50s and 60s, the studios were exploring ways to regain economic stability, and they became more open to new production strategies and new blood, new talent. The 60s cinema attendance nosedived sharply for a number of reasons. There was a steep decline in cinema attendance, partly because of suburbanization and families moving out to the suburbs away from the city centres where the cinemas were located. And obviously the rise of television in the 50s, families would stay home and watch films on television rather than pay to go into the cities, and it could be a costly endeavour. So there was that. Hollywood was trying to recover the cinema, theatre-going audience. And they'd lost out, and I think in the 60s they were really losing out large sections of the audience, particularly the sizable and potentially lucrative youth demographic. The films they were making in the 60s really didn't appeal to young people, teens and people in their early 20s. There were very expensive, calamitous flops in the 60s, kind of notorious fiascos. So they were making lavish musicals like Paint Your Wagon, historical sagas like Cleopatra, Mutiny on the Bounty. None of these films really resonated with a young audience.
Yeah.
And they costed really, a huge, vast amounts of money, and didn't make sufficient profit. So the studios were floundering, and as I say, they became receptive to new talent. And around that time, sort of mid-1960s, there was a new crop of filmmakers emerging. People like Scorsese, Woody Allen, Robert Altman, Hal Ashby, Spielberg, Lucas, the names that are familiar to us today. Yeah. And there's one more thing, the old production code of the 1930s, I think it was established in the 30s, the censorship system, the Hays Code, was abolished around 1966. I think it took a couple of years to kind of be phased out, but that's when the rating system came in, and that allowed filmmakers a new kind of permissiveness. They called it the new freedom of the screen. So filmmakers could sort of strive for a greater degree of realism because they could depict sexuality and violence in more frank, explicit ways. They could use profanity, so they could try to capture the way that people spoke in real life and so on. So it's quite a sustained period there of industrial change and upheaval.
Now, were these films and filmmakers financed by Hollywood, or were they more independent that broke onto the scene on their own?
Well, they were independent, many of them, but they worked in tandem with the major studios. So the films would be produced independently very often, but then they would be picked up for distribution by, Columbia or Paramount, one of the major studios. So they could be produced quite cheaply. I mean, there was an independent production outfit called BBS. They made films like Easy Rider and 5 Easy Pieces. The Last Picture Show. They made, they had a budget of around $1 million. I think it was up to $1 million per film. So they could be made relatively cheaply. They would be distributed by, one of the majors. I think Columbia distributed Easy Rider. So the major studio would take care of the distribution costs, and then these films would reap, the ones that were commercially successful made a heck of a lot of money. I think The Last Picture Show made about $30 million. It cost $1 million. So, these were potentially lucrative, and there was a short window there, a short period of just a few years. Some critics argue that by 1971, that brief period of dominance, where the independent companies were kind of taking the lead, that by 71 it had begun to fizzle out, and the films were becoming less commercially successful.
So what were some of the early films that sort of opened this up?
Yeah. Well, as I say, people generally say 67 was the year that started the new Hollywood. There were precursors around mid-60s, so you could point to things like Arthur Penn's Mickey 1, or Mike Nichols' film Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, that had more adult themes. Tried for a greater degree of verisimilitude, greater degree of realism. But then 67, you had the sort of the 1-2 punch of The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde. Films with a kind of countercultural ethos, appealing to the youth market, anti-establishment, anti-authority, anti-achievement, anti-corporation. These sensibilities seem to be appealing, particularly to the younger members of the audience at that time. Older critics, found films like Bonnie and Clyde obscene. So it's not clear that the older generation really understood or approved of some of these new types of films that suddenly emerged on the scene.
Where did some of these filmmakers come from? Were they localized? Like I know Scorsese sort of opened up the New York cinematic scene, and then you had Lucas and Spielberg down in USC.
No, I think that's where they ended up. Obviously Scorsese, Sidney Lumet were New York filmmakers, and they based their production operations there. A lot of Hollywood filmmakers obviously working in Los Angeles. Those were the main filmmaking centers. That's actually incidentally one of the key appeals, at least for me, of these films, is that they conjure a really palpable sense of place. I mean, many of the films were shot on location, and watching these films as a young man, teenager. I'd never been to America, but it felt like I had. They really, really almost a documentary style
sensibility, yeah, for sure.
Kind of rhetoric. Yeah, kind of documentary rhetoric that captured the texture of the locations in which these stories were set, and New York jumps off the screen. You get a really palpable, vivid sense of that place, and in a way that I think some more recent films sacrifice that kind of quality. With the rise of CGI, and there's a lack of indexicality, if you like, a lack of tactility to some of these mainstream films that we have nowadays. I think that was a key appeal, certainly to the realism of the films of the new Hollywood.
It sounds like there's some similarities between this movement and the French New Wave.
Very much so, yeah. Well, I mean, filmmakers. Bonnie and Clyde was originally to be directed by Godard.
Oh.
And Truffaut was circling it as well before it ended up in the hands of Arthur Penn and Warren Beatty. A lot of new Hollywood filmmakers were directly influenced by not just the French New Wave, but the European art cinema in general of the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
So they were really interesting, I think, these new Hollywood filmmakers in fusing influences from, as you say, French New Wave, Italian neorealism, De Sica and Rossellini and Michelangelo Antonioni. These new Hollywood filmmakers studied those directors, and European art cinema was very much available in the 1960s in America. It wasn't really marginal, it became quite central to film culture in America. So they fused influence from the European New Wave cinemas and influence from classical Hollywood, because they grew up, in the age of television, as I said before, and they would watch old reruns of classic Hollywood movies, and they would, when they became filmmakers, they're called the movie brats. They studied movies, both classical Hollywood movies and European art films. When they became filmmakers, they incorporated references and allusions to classical Hollywood films, and some of the filmmakers did this in a kind of nostalgic, sentimental way. So they would try to recreate and recapture the genres and styles that they admired as youngsters, and some had a more kind of critical approach to classic Hollywood and would animate the old genres, but then try to subvert the conventions and undermine them,
right,
and experiment, probe the limits of those genres. So something like Chinatown or Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye, McCabe and Mrs. Miller. These are films that are considered revisionist films.
Right.
But they owe a debt to the classical genres of the 40s and 50s.
Now, was this an era where they talk about the personal film being so important?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, this was also the period in which the auteur theory comes into currency in America. As you know, it was developed by the Cahiers du Cinema critics in France, and then it gets imported into America by a number of people, but this is chiefly Andrew Sarris, and it's a slightly distorted version of the French auteurism, but it nevertheless gains currency.
So who
in America?
Who is this Andrew?
Andrew Sarris.
Sarris.
Yeah, it's American. Sarris. Yeah, Sarris. Along with Pauline Kael, he was one of the most prominent film critics of that period.
So
there are others as well, some Stanley Kaufman. There was Bosley Crowther, who was the critic I had in mind when I said, there was a negative reaction to Bonnie and Clyde. He wrote a famous review of that film, just castigating it, and effectively ended his career with that review. Yes, but Sarris brought the auteur theory to the United States, and it led into American film culture, and it fed into the film industry itself, so that the new directors, the movie brats, self-consciously styled themselves as auteurs, as film authors with, distinctive personal signatures, styles, and thematic preoccupations. They conceived themselves as visionaries, artists with a distinctive distinctive personal vision, and tried to carpenter a body of work that would be kind of stylistically and thematically coherent.
Wow. So Sarris was sort of like the Bazan, I guess, of this movement. So he was a critic.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So how did he bring this in? He sort of made it popularized with his criticism.
That's right. Yeah. He wrote a book. He wrote an article and then a book, and he kind of came up with a taxonomy, a kind of list of film directors, American film directors, who he suggested qualified as auteurs, you know.
Mm.
I mean, in a way, the Coyote cinema critics had already been doing this, hadn't they? I mean, they admired American filmmakers like Hitchcock and Otto Preminger and Wells and Wyler and Hawks,
Right.
you know, so they were already talking about the Hollywood filmmakers as artists in a way that those directors really weren't spoken about at home. You know,
Right.
they were considered, you know, entertainment, you know, purveyors of entertainment rather than purveyors of art.
So this lasted maybe a decade.
The New Hollywood, yeah, as I say, there are debates around periodization. Some people say that it starts around 67 and goes through the 70s and ends with Apocalypse Now, which was 1979. Some people say it ends with Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, you know, and that launches the blockbuster. So there are disagreements, but most people, I think, most film historians, when they write about the New Hollywood, broadly describing 67 to 75, you know, Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate through Jaws.
Now, some of the French New Wave filmmakers did make it into this movement, no?
Well, you mean as directors?
Yeah, because they did bring some of them over to do a couple films.
So I don't know that they signed any. I mean, Francois Truffaut made Fahrenheit 451, but I think that's not considered a part of the New Hollywood, and it was.
Okay.
It preceded 67, I think, and I don't think it was I'm not convinced it was a Hollywood production. I might be wrong about that.
Okay. What about Antonioni?
Oh, well, no, that's a good point, yeah. So he made Zabriskie Point, didn't he? And Blow Up.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's strange because those films, they're generally left out of the New Hollywood canon, which is why they didn't jump to mind when you mentioned it.
Ah, okay.
But you're right, they definitely fall in that period. And he makes a film in 75 called The Passenger with Jack Nicholson. And it's a really great film. So he does begin to make English language films. I think Blow Up has kind of, I think has a strong British influence. So I'm not sure about the details behind that production.
Yeah, it was also in French, no?
Yeah, and it's sort of depicting the swinging 60s, isn't it, in London? So
yeah.
It probably has some British finance in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But certainly Godard didn't come, Truffaut didn't come. Like I say, they flirted with Hollywood, and they almost made Bonnie and Clyde because they were attracted by the idea of making a kind of classic Hollywood genre picture. You know, cops and robbers.
Right.
Heist movie.
Yeah. So who are some of the strongest voices in this movement?
Well, it's hard to homogenize this movement because the closer you look at it, the more you realize there are different strands to it. I mean, there was a countercultural strain of filmmaking, which was, like I said, films like Easy Rider, Five Easy Pieces, typically independent produced, sometimes distributed by a major studio. And those directors would be people like Bob Rafelson. He directed Five Easy Pieces, The King of Marvin Gardens. People like Robert Altman, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, you know, MASH, The Long Goodbye. Arthur Penn directed Bonnie and Clyde and a film called Night Moves with Gene Hackman. So in these, they would cast the sort of more dynamic, somewhat youthful, new, young actor / stars. So people like Nicholson, Al Pacino, Jane Fonda, Faye Dunaway, Gene Hackman, you know. So there was that type of filmmaking that was really influenced by the European cinema. So critics generally say that they're more character driven than plot driven. that the characters are kind of unmotivated. They don't have clear-cut goals that they're trying to pursue. So the narratives, as a result, become fairly digressive and meandering because they don't have that kind of forward momentum, that propulsive quality that classical Hollywood films have. And they tended to be open-ended and downbeat. Right? So that was the endings would be pretty pessimistic or apocalyptic, and that was the countercultural strain. But at the same time, there was a strong commercial cinema. The studio productions didn't disappear. So there were films like Love Story, and The Godfather, which I think counts as a personal film, but it's also a major Hollywood production. Star-studded, big budget. It's an event movie. It's a prestige movie. And then there was the disaster movie, the disaster genre, Airport, Poseidon Adventure, Towering Inferno, and these were big blockbuster movies and really precursors to the blockbuster trend that emerged in the late 70s.
Right.
So in terms of what we think of as the new Hollywood, Hal Ashby would be a major figure. Mm-hmm. He had a pretty remarkable run in the 70s. Harold and Maude, The Last Detail, Being There, Shampoo, and people like Brian De Palma.
Yeah.
Alan J. Pakula made a I think they call it the Paranoid trilogy.
Yeah.
Sort of conspiracy thrillers in the 70s. All the President's Men and the Parallax View.
Right. How does Coppola fit in this?
Yeah, he's an interesting one. He's sort of like, he is the kind of godfather to the new generation. Mm-hmm. I mean, he'd won an Oscar for Best Screenplay for Patton a couple of years before The Godfather. So he had a slight jump on his contemporaries. Mm-hmm. He became, a major famous filmmaker before most of the others. And he was a filmmaker. He's very interesting because he does seem to manage to combine the major studio mode of film production with the personal vision. I mean, The Godfather 2 feels like, an auteurist film, even though it's done on this huge canvas. You could say the same of The Godfather, but then the conversation is a very small, personal, relatively low budget, intimate drama, the sort that probably wouldn't get major studio financing today. Mm. And then at the end of the 70s, he spends a few years making Apocalypse Now, which some people regard as an expression of hubris, and as a kind of symbolic end of the new Hollywood, because this is what would you say, a kind of embodiment of self-indulgence, of excess, of production schedules spiraling out of control and production budgets, mushrooming, and that's one of the reasons that critics suggest brings about the downfall of the new Hollywood as a whole in the mid to late 70s, a kind of egotism and hubris, not just Coppola's, but people like Peter Bogdanovich and Lucas and Scorsese. I mean, there's another sense in which that term, the movie brats, brats being the operative word, they were called that for a reason. That's a claim of a critic like Peter Biskind, who wrote the book Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, about the 70s New Hollywood film period. He basically says that cinema, that type of filmmaking, imploded. It was self-destruction on the part of the filmmakers who were sort of brought down by their own. These young Turks were brought down by their own inflated sense of self.
Huh. I know that Coppola talks about how he had to finance a lot of his own films. So even though he
Mm,
was, the Hollywood, uh, star in this thing, uh, he still had a
yeah,
struggle with the system.
right. Yes, I mean, I think that's true. Paramount produced The Godfather and The Godfather Part Two. Coppola launched his own production studio, Zoetrope,
Yeah.
in the 70s as well, and that was the company that produced Apocalypse Now and a few other films in the early 80s, I think. But it was a short-lived company. But I think, yes, if you read accounts of the making of The Godfather, he had to fight to cast Brando. He had a struggle on his hands to cast Al Pacino because the
Right.
studios wanted other players. So he
Right.
didn't get things his own way. But I think after The Godfather, which was such a huge commercial success and critical success, it brought a lot of credibility and prestige to the studio. Won all of the, won several major Oscars. I think that gave him the freedom to make a film like The Conversation, and certainly The Godfather 2 as well, which repeated the success of its predecessor.
Yeah.
Gave him a certain amount of leverage with the studios.
Yeah. He was also instrumental in getting Lucas in doing his films.
Hmm. Yeah,
And I
as I understand, he's a kind of mentor, to figures like figures like Lucas. Yeah.
because I remember Lucas talking on an interview with somebody about how he and Coppola were very frustrated with the studio systems and
Well, I mean, Lucas is an interesting figure because he starts out making kind of new Hollywood, what we think of as new Hollywood films in the early 70s, like American Graffiti. And then he becomes the blockbuster guy, you know,
yeah.
and unfairly perhaps is tagged with, um, you know, ushering in a new period of, I mean, this is a false narrative in a way, but, bringing in a new phase of blockbuster filmmaking that's more about commerce than it is about artistic expression.
Right.
Um, because he made Star Wars, and that set a whole cycle of fantasy, science fiction, space opera films
Yeah.
in motion. So he's interesting. He kind of straddles both trends, if you like.
Scorsese, of all these directors, Scorsese is the one who seems to have the most legs to cross over the whole era. He was sort of an embodiment of that movement, but now he's also sort of maintaining, I guess, some of his sensibilities from that era as well, even though he's more of
Uh-huh.
a Hollywood fixture.
Yes, I mean, he starts out. He doesn't start. His first film is not Mean Streets, but that's his sort of breakthrough film. So that was
Yeah.
1973. Mobster movie set in New York. Um, Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro, and now we have The Irishman, and you have a lot of films in between, but it's kind of like harking back to his roots, you know.
Yeah.
And there's obviously films like Goodfellas in between. And he's a very versatile filmmaker, and
Yeah.
uh, I guess there are very few genres that he hasn't tried his hand at, you know,
Hmm.
pretty much always with interesting results. And
Yeah.
this Joker film, which I think he was attached to as producer for a while, but this is a film that's sort of steeped in references to early-ish Scorsese, films like Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. De Niro's in it too, of course. Yeah, it's trying to be a character study. It doesn't even have a nemesis for the joke. It doesn't have a superhero in it, So yeah, it's trying to experiment with the genre and offer audiences something different.
Now it's interesting. One of the films you told me that was sort of key, and you've written a number of books or in articles on is Superman.
Yeah, well, that was after Star Wars, the year after Star Wars. So by this point, the blockbuster formula had sort of concretized. So it's a return for the major Hollywood studios to family entertainment, I guess you would say. This is one way in which they managed to regain economic stability in the mid to late 70s, the blockbuster mode of production. So films based on pre-established properties, novels or comic books, flaunting movie stars and spectacle, special effects, generating a lot of merchandise, toys and so on, T-shirts, what they call walking billboards, all kinds of spin-off products. Jaws, something like Jaws introduced saturation advertising, where, you would have these 30-second spots on TV, 30-second little trailers for the film on TV. That was kind of new. And saturation release as well. So I think, again, Jaws opened in, about 460-ish theatres in America. So rather than release a film in one city and then gradually roll it out across the country, this was a principle of saturation release, a system of mass release. So Superman opened in about 700 theatres in 78. So Superman is very much, working on that model of production, that mode of production. And in terms of ideology, it's a return to conservatism. If you think of the countercultural new Hollywood films as being primarily left-wing liberal films, ideologically speaking, something like Superman and Star Wars tries to restore faith in the family, the American dream. The American Superman fights for the American way. It's kind of trying to reaffirm the values of the American dream, those values that American audiences have apparently lost faith in. When in the early 70s, the Watergate era, and in the wake of Vietnam and so on.
Since Jaws was sort of the first film that brings us out of that movement, what did the transition from this movement into the blockbuster era look like?
Well, like I said, it wasn't a complete break. So it wasn't like the sort of low budget countercultural strain of filmmaking just was stopped in its tracks. There was spillover. So it was a gradual transition, but so for example, you had films like Taxi Driver in 1976, so it comes after Jaws. You had Raging Bull in 1980, so these films were still being made. You could argue The Deer Hunter falls into that category as well. That was 78. But, there was no denying the might of the commercial might of the Hollywood blockbusters. You had, in quick succession, Jaws, Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Superman. I think there was a Star Trek movie around the same time as well, the motion picture. So that was all in the space of a few years in the late 70s. Because they were so commercially profitable, they just dominated. They just clinched their place at the economic center of Hollywood film production, and pretty much that mode of filmmaking has stayed there ever since. The comic book movies we have today are just the latest iteration, but they're still based on that principle of, blockbuster production or high concept production. You can convey the plot. Spielberg, I think, has that famous quote, something like, if you can describe the plot of the film in 25 words or less, it'll make a movie. You can sum up stories that are easily digestible, that are told primarily through special effects and spectacle.
Well, that sort of dominates what we're doing today, because when you read these books on screenwriting and how to develop a film, and it's all focused on these log lines and very simple ways of being able to do the elevator pitch real quick. And if you can't elevator pitch it, it's not going to be interesting to a studio or a production company.
Yes, I mean, the critics of the cinema today complain about the formulaic storytelling, the kind of mechanical storytelling. It's rote storytelling. It's, like you say, it's based on the advice given in the screenplay manuals by the screenwriting gurus, 3 acts, turning points, character arcs. And the argument is that screenwriters have kind of mechanically, slavishly followed that advice, to the extent that a lot of films today, structurally, are pretty much cookie cutter versions, the same thing. It's a broad brush argument, and I'm not wholly convinced of it. But that's a common complaint that you hear from detractors of mainstream Hollywood cinema, the current period, what they call the post-classical period, really, which is from 1975 up to the present. The period of cinema that comes after the demise of the classical era.
Yeah, the sentiment that I've heard is that Star Wars destroyed the personal film, and then what followed was the studio system trying to figure out how to repeat the success of Star Wars. And I think the guy who wrote Easy Rider, Raging Bull, that book, I think he talks about this. The story gurus that we have today were part of that, trying to figure out what did Lucas get out of Joseph Campbell, and how can we put that into a structure or formula to continue making these kinds of blockbusters. And so over the years, the personal film and these films that were made in the 70s would never be made today because they would never get past a studio evaluation.
Yes. I mean, I'm not wholly convinced that the personal filmmaking has died away. Certainly those types of films are no longer as central to Hollywood mainstream production as they were in the 70s. But unless some people want to make a case that the current crop of superhero movies qualify as personal expressions. I mean, some people have made that claim about the Joker film, for instance. But I think there are filmmakers working today who try to tell personal stories and who take inspiration from the new Hollywood. I think they're out there.
Do you think Sundance was a response to this change from the personal film into the blockbuster system?
I think so. Yes. I mean, that was Robert Redford's brainchild, wasn't it? To try to nurture an independent American film system. I think that you can't underestimate the value of that. And there are some sort of synergies, I guess, between the American independent cinema of the 90s, which really gathered force, and the films that we're talking about now, the new Hollywood films. There is a kind of lineage there, especially, you think of Richard Linklater. He's very much indebted to the films of Hal Ashby, and especially, I think, Robert Altman. The narrative structure of something like Slacker owes a debt to the multiple protagonist films of Altman in the 70s, Nashville, and so on. Linklater even made a sequel to a new Hollywood film, a belated sequel. He made a film called Last Flag Flying a few years ago, which was a sequel to Hal Ashby's The Last Detail. I think David Fincher, a film like Zodiac, harks back to All the President's Men. Alexander Payne is another one, all about Schmidt and Nebraska. Foreground the actors from some of the actors from the new Hollywood movies. Kenneth Lonergan directed Manchester by the Sea and Margaret, and You Can Count on Me. I mean, I think these are personal films with a new Hollywood flavor. Paul Thomas Anderson, people talk about him a lot as kind of carrying that tradition forward.
I see these new independent films that are very personal coming on platforms like Amazon Originals and Netflix and those kinds of things. So I think the streaming services have opened up doors into more of an independent personal film.
Right, that's interesting. Yes, I think that's partly Scorsese's point, I think, in this article that he wrote recently, is that he's sort of bemoaning the fact that the tentpole movies, these comic book movies, have become so dominant that they're squeezing out smaller films, independent films, personal films from the theatres, so that if you want to see those films, you're not likely to find them in the movie theatres. You're going to have to find them, as you say, through streaming sites or perhaps in independent art house theatres.
Well, Gary, this has been fascinating. I thank you so much for joining me and sharing your knowledge of this.
Oh, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
In a future episode, Dr. Bettinson will join us again to talk about another era of cinema that he's very passionate about, and that is the Hong Kong cinema. And that interview is going to be a real treat. If you want to find out more about the new Hollywood cinema, Dr. Bettinson has given me a list of recommended books to read, and I've listed those in the show notes on the website. In our next episode, I've invited Tim Kazee to the podcast. Tim is the host of a very interesting series of documentary DVDs called Dispatches from the Front. I've been watching these for many years. He and his colleagues have to date produced 13 DVDs which they distribute on their own, and they're making a significant impact on the church. You don't want to miss this episode. Thank you for joining me on the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast. You'll find show notes and more information about us at ministryofmotionpictures.org.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.